The metallic tang of ozone hung faint in the frigid air, a constant companion in the dome. My breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost against the banks of monitors that glowed with the distant, indifferent light of the cosmos. Outside, the night was a vast, inky canvas speckled with diamonds that felt impossibly far, impossibly ancient. This was my sanctuary, my cage, my life's work, the deepest reaches of the universe, observed from this lonely perch at the mountain observatory. I'd been running a deep field scan, a routine sweep of a particularly barren patch of space, a cosmic void, truly. Billions of light years across, utterly devoid of galaxies, nebulae, or even significant dark matter concentrations. Or so we thought. My fingers danced across the console, adjusting filters, tweaking gain. The hum of the massive primary mirror above me was a low thrum against the bone, a vibration that had become as natural as my own heartbeat. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting patterns on the screens, the gradual descent of exhaustion into a state of hyper-focused vigilance. I watched for the subtle flicker of a nascent star, the gravitational lens of an unseen cluster, anything to fill the emptiness. Then, a spike. It wasn't a blip, a transient burst of cosmic rays, or the familiar signature of a distant quasar flaring. This was different. My eyes, accustomed to the rhythmic ebb and flow of background noise, immediately snagged on the anomaly. A sharp, narrow peak on the frequency spectrum, completely out of place. It pulsed, not with the regular cadence of a pulsar, nor the chaotic burst of a supernova remnant, but with an erratic, almost deliberate irregularity. My first thought was equipment malfunction. It always was. A loose cable, a power surge, a stray bit of interference from the distant town, lights 100 mundane explanations sprang to mind. Annoyance. That's what it was. Annoyance at the interruption. I initiated a diagnostic sweep, a thorough check of every sensor, every receiver, every circuit board in the array. The system ran its internal checks with its usual quiet efficiency. Status reports scrolled across a secondary monitor, all systems nominal. Environmental controls stable. Data integrity verified. No errors, nothing. The spike remained. I tried isolating it, narrowing the aperture of the virtual telescope. The signal sharpened, gaining definition, still refusing to conform to any known astrophysical signature. It wasn't thermal radiation, not gravitational waves, not even the faint echo of the cosmic microwave background. It was something else. Something utterly alien to the expected symphony of the universe. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. My determination to dismiss it warred with a rising, unwelcome curiosity. This wasn't just noise, it had structure. Not repeating, no, but evolving. Like a complex, non-linear code, shifting, twisting, never quite settling into a recognizable pattern. It was too intricate for random chance, too persistent for a fleeting glitch. My hands trembled slightly as I began to log the data. Every parameter, every observed characteristic. I tagged it as Anomaly Void Sector 7. The cursor blinked, awaiting my notes. Unidentified, non-repeating signal. I pushed back from the console, standing slowly, my joints stiff from hours of immobility. The stars. And for a moment, just a flicker, the mountain observatory, stars began moving. Not the gentle drift of celestial bodies across the sky due to Earth's rotation, but a profound, almost imperceptible shift in their positions, their relationships to one another. Like a vast, unseen hand had gently nudged the fabric of space itself. I blinked hard, my vision blurring for an instant. When I refocused, they were still fixed in their familiar constellations. A trick of tired eyes, I told myself. A side effect of staring at impossible signals for too long. But the image of that subtle, impossible motion lingered, a phantom sensation behind my eyes. What was it trying to say? Or, more terrifyingly, what was it trying to do? The frigid air of the mountain observatory still carried that faint, metallic tang of ozone, a constant companion that seemed to sharpen my senses, or perhaps just make me shiver. Outside, the night was a vast, inky canvas speckled with diamonds that felt different now, changed. I'd spent the last 36 hours hunched over the main console, a steady drip of lukewarm coffee the only fuel for my burning eyes. The initial burst of excitement, that raw jolt of discovery, had curdled into something colder, more unsettling. The signal, the impossible whisper from the void, was still there, persistent, unwavering. My fingers flew across the holographic interface, pulling up waveform analyses, frequency modulations, spectral breakdowns. I ran every known algorithm, every filter developed over decades of listening to the universe's natural cacophony. Supernova, pulsars, quasars, the faint echo of the Big Bang itself, I knew their signatures. I knew the random noise of galactic interference, the subtle hum of cosmic background radiation. This was none of that. It started subtly. A pattern within a pattern, not a simple repetition like a pulsar's beat, but something more intricate like a fractal unfolding. I zoomed in, then zoomed in again, watching the luminous lines on the screen. Each layer revealed a deeper, more complex structure, never quite repeating, always evolving. My first thought was a glitch, an error in the detector, or perhaps some incredibly rare, unknown astrophysical phenomenon. The universe was full of surprises, after all, but the deeper I delved, the more my certainty wavered. I cross-referenced the data with every known physical emission, every theoretical particle interaction. Nothing fit. The energy profile of the signal was paradoxical. It wasn't radio, not gamma, not X-ray. It didn't behave like a gravitational wave, nor did it carry the signature of any known neutrino flux. It was a pure, focused energy, yet it existed outside the spectrum I understood. It defied classification. My head began to throb with a dull ache behind my eyes. A colleague, the lead technician, poked his head into the dome around what must have been dawn. "Raj, still here? I look like I wrestled a nebula." He offered me a lukewarm thermal mug. "Sleep. The data won't go anywhere." I barely registered his words, my gaze fixed on the screen. "It's not random," I murmured, my voice raspy. "Not even pseudo-random, it's structured." He chuckled, stepping closer. "Everything has structure, Raj, even chaos has rules." I shook my head, my jaw tight. "No, this is different. This is designed." I pointed to a particularly intricate sequence of pulses, each one a nested series of smaller, perfectly aligned oscillations. "Look at this. The mathematical precision is impossible for a natural phenomenon of this scale. It implies intent." The technician peered at the screen, his brow furrowing. He was good, but his expertise lay in maintenance, not theoretical astrophysics. "You're overthinking it. Get some rest." He left, the soft click of the door echoing in the vast dome. I ignored him. I couldn't rest. The signal was demanding my attention, pulling me deeper into its labyrinthine logic. I started trying to find a baseline, a repeating unit, anything that could be interpreted as a word or a symbol. Days blurred into nights. The scent of stale coffee and my own unwashed clothes became my personal atmosphere. My phone buzzed occasionally with calls from the project director, from other colleagues, but I let them ring, their distant chimes an annoyance against the relentless, silent clamor of the signal. I knew they were worried or annoyed or both. I didn't care. The mountain observatory stars began moving, not in their usual stately celestial dance, but in my own perception. My vision blurred from exhaustion, the pinprick lights outside the dome appearing to shift, to coalesce into impossible shapes. I rubbed my eyes, the gritty feeling a stark reminder of how long I'd been awake. But its evolving complexity, its utterly alien yet undeniably intelligent structure, felt like a constant mocking echo. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was a conversation I couldn't understand. A message woven from the very fabric of an unknown reality. This wasn't just a discovery. It felt like an invitation or a trap. Was I merely observing an anomaly, or had something truly incomprehensible begun to observe me? I still felt the hum of it, a vibration in the air around me, not quite sound, but an insistent pressure against my eardrums. The signal offered no verbal reply, of course. A message woven from the very fabric of an unknown reality, and I was determined to unravel its syntax. Days bled into nights at the mountain observatory. Stars began moving in their celestial dance above. My world narrowed to the glow of monitors, the click of keyboards, and the endless, intricate dance of the signal's data streams. I pushed through exhaustion, fueled by a frantic curiosity that gnawed at me, a hunger for understanding. My fingers, stained with stale coffee and a faint metallic tang from hours spent adjusting equipment, flew across the interface. I was trying to build a new translation algorithm, something that could map its structure onto human logic, even if it meant tearing down every assumption I held about communication. It started subtly. A flicker in the main display, just a momentary ripple across the bright interface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Fatigue, I told myself. Then the auxiliary monitor, usually a steady green, momentarily bled to a deep, bruised purple before snapping back. I tapped the casing, solid, no loose connections. I ran diagnostics, but the system reported perfect health. A shiver traced its way down my spine, cool and sharp. Later, as I was compiling a particularly dense data packet, the server rack behind me, a familiar whirring beast, suddenly stuttered. Its steady drone became a series of ragged coughs, followed by a high-pitched whine that grated against my teeth. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against me. I spun in my chair, my heart giving a hard thump against my ribs. The server lights, usually a calm cascade of green, pulsed erratically, a frantic red flash interspersed with yellow. I reached out a hand, feeling the metallic casing. It vibrated, not with its usual industrial hum, but with a strange, almost organic thrum like a trapped insect. I pulled my hand back sharply. The server settled, its drone returning to normal, but the memory of that unnatural vibration lingered on my fingertips. The next morning, the ambient sounds of the observatory felt wrong. The wind outside, usually a mournful sigh against the reinforced glass, now seemed to carry faint whispers, not distinct words, but an undeniable cadence, a rhythm that was too complex for mere atmospheric disturbance. I paused, tilting my head, straining to hear. There was a low, guttural murmur beneath the howl. My stomach clenched. I pressed my ear against the cool window pane, trying to discern the source, but the sound dissolved into the ordinary wind as soon as I focused. Then came the visual disruptions, brief, disorienting flashes. While reviewing a spectral analysis, a jagged, dark shape, like a shard of obsidian, momentarily filled the corner of my vision. It was gone before I could fully register it, leaving behind only the impression of something impossibly ancient and sharp. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. Nothing but the familiar patterns of data. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of my desk. Was I finally breaking? There was the sheer scale of the signal, its alien complexity, fracturing my perception. I needed an anchor, something to ground me. My scientific training demanded a rational explanation. If it wasn't equipment failure or fatigue, what else could it be? I started casting a wider net, delving into obscure historical archives, searching for any record, any myth, any forgotten tale that might hint at similar phenomena. I sifted through digitized scrolls, scanned ancient texts on forgotten servers, chasing ghosts of knowledge. Weeks of fruitless searching, of dead ends and esoteric ramblings, finally yielded a flicker of something. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of a university's digital library, filed under comparative mythology, pre-Babylonian, I found it. Another passage from a crumbling parchment discovered in a forgotten subterranean vault spoke of a great hum that would sometimes descend, distorting sight and sound, weaving unreality into the waking world. It detailed rituals, not of worship, of placation meant to ward off the gnawing presence that listens from beyond the veil. The descriptions were vague, metaphorical. I scrolled through more, finding references to the geometry of madness and patterns that unravel the mind. These were not the ramblings of madmen, not entirely. There was a consistency, a terrifying thread connecting these disparate accounts across millennia and cultures. And the effect, the dissolution of conventional reality. My fingers paused over a particularly disturbing illustration, a crudely drawn spiral, not symmetrical, but impossibly complex, like a fractal that folded in on itself. Below it, the text read, "The true form is not seen, but felt. It is the echo of a thought too vast for flesh." A sudden, sharp crack from the corner of the room made me jump. I looked up, eyes wide, to see a fine, hairline fissure spiderwebbing across the plaster wall. It hadn't been there moments ago. There was the observatory itself beginning to unravel. The hum had followed me, a low-frequency drone that vibrated in the deepest cavities of my skull, even after I'd powered down the primary receivers. It wasn't loud, not a sound I could point to, but a persistent pressure, like standing too close to a generator. I tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably on the cot in the small adjacent room, but my mind was a churning vortex of signal fragments and half-formed theories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw impossible geometries, angles that defied Euclidean space, curves that bent back on themselves in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. I gave up on sleep around 3 in the morning. My eyes felt gritty, my joints ached, but the drive to understand, to decode, was a relentless engine inside me. Back at the console, the screens glowed, displaying the intricate, evolving patterns of the signal. It was still there, of course, a constant, mocking presence. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Was it fatigue, this sense of being watched, of the air itself being thick with an unseen intelligence? I tried to rationalize it, to blame the isolation of the mountain observatory, the thin air, the sheer mental strain. Then the first dream came. I must have drifted off, slumped in my chair, my head resting on the cool metal of the console. It wasn't a typical dream. There was no beginning, no transition. I was simply there. A vastness unfolded before me, not space as I knew it, but an expanse of shifting, shimmering planes of an unknown substance. Colors pulsed not from light, but from some internal, resonant energy, and the scale, it was beyond comprehension. Mountains of impossible angles rose and fell, not solid but fluid, constantly reshaping themselves into forms that my mind struggled to grasp. My breath hitched. I felt tiny, a microscopic speck in a cosmic ocean of alien consciousness. There was a sense of immense weight, not physical but existential, pressing down on me, threatening to flatten my very being. A silent, ancient hum resonated through this impossible landscape, the same hum I'd felt in my skull, amplified 1,000-fold. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but utterly indifferent, uncaring in a way that chilled me far more than any overt threat. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My chest felt hollow. I woke with a gasp, my body rigid, a thin sheen of sweat coating my skin. The console light was still on my face. Had I been asleep for seconds or hours? My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The lingering impression was not of a dream, but of a memory implanted, a direct sensory download. My hands trembled as I reached for the lukewarm coffee. The hum was louder now, a distinct vibration in the air, a physical presence. I felt a subtle pressure behind my eyes, as if something was pushing from the inside, trying to expand my skull. I blinked, trying to clear the lingering images from my vision. The lines of the equipment, the familiar contours of the lab seemed softer, less defined. They was my brain simply overloaded, creating these distortions. I tried to immerse myself in the data again to find solace in the objective patterns, the raw numbers, but the signal had changed. It wasn't just a pattern on a screen anymore. It had become a lens. As I stared at the intricate waveforms, I started to see through them. For a fleeting second, the wall behind the main screen rippled like water disturbed by an unseen current. It wasn't a trick of the light. A single, colossal eye, perhaps. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The wall was solid again, immutable. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I pushed back from the console, standing up abruptly. My legs felt unsteady. I needed air. I walked to the observation dome, the immense telescope a silent sentinel against the pre-dawn sky. I looked out, seeking the reassuring vastness of familiar stars. But even there, the distortions had begun. As I peered through the dome's opening, the mountain observatory, stars began moving. Not just the usual drift of the night sky, but an impossible fluid shift. Constellations warped, stretched into elongated spirals, then snapped back into place. Polaris seemed to swim, then split into 3 shimmering points. My stomach lurched. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. My perception, my very senses, were being rewired. The hum intensified, becoming a low thrum that vibrated not just in my head, but in my bones, my teeth. My teeth ached. My eyes burned. The images from my dream returned, superimposed on my vision, impossible angles, shifting planes, the crushing weight of an alien consciousness. It wasn't just sending a signal anymore. It was projecting directly into my mind. It was showing me things, forcing me to perceive a reality that defied every law of physics I knew. I stumbled back, gripping the railing of the dome. This was no anomaly. This was an intrusion, a direct, conscious assault on my perception. What was it trying to show me? What terrible truth was it attempting to force into my awareness, shattering the very foundations of what I believed to be real? I tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably in the cot at the mountain observatory, but my mind raced. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every creak of the old structure amplified into something knowing. My eyes burned from lack of rest, the skin under them a bruised purple. I could taste the metallic tang of exhaustion at the back of my throat, a constant companion. I knew I needed to present my findings. The data, raw and unyielding, was piled on my desk. Graphs that defied astrophysics, spectrograms that whispered of impossible frequencies, positional data pointing to an emptiness that pulsed with malignant life. My hand trembled as I compiled the slides, each click of the mouse a jarring intrusion into the silent thrumming in my head. I rehearsed my words, but they felt flimsy, inadequate against the sheer, crushing weight of what I'd found. The conference room felt too warm, too bright. The faces of my colleagues blurred into a single, expectant gaze. I could feel the hum vibrating behind my eyes, making the fluorescent lights flicker at the edges of my vision. My voice, when I began, was a strained rasp, not the confident tone I'd practiced. I gestured wildly at the screen, pointing to anomalies that to them were just noise. I spoke of impossible signals, of a presence that defied all known physics, of an entity that seemed to wake when I listened. My hands shook, sending the laser pointer dancing across the projected images, a frantic red dot that mirrored the chaos in my mind. A colleague in the front row, a senior researcher I'd always respected, shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed not with scientific curiosity but with a palpable concern. It wasn't just my data they were questioning, it was me. Had I lost the thread? The rejection wasn't immediate, not a sudden slamming door, but a slow, insidious withdrawal. Emails went unanswered. Invitations to informal discussions ceased. When I approached the head of the department, a man whose tenure was built on cautious, incremental discoveries, he simply placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip too firm, his eyes too pitying. He spoke of stress and overwork, suggesting a break from the observatory. He didn't dismiss my data outright, not in words, but his tone implied a deeper, more personal failing on my part. They thought I was breaking. They thought I was mad. But the hum was still there, a constant reminder that I was closer to a truth than they could ever imagine. What did they truly see when they looked at me? The mountain observatory. Stars began moving, became a cage. I was still there, but effectively exiled, cut off from funding, from collaboration, from the very scientific community I had dedicated my life to. The hum intensified in my isolation, a constant companion that seemed to draw me further into itself. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, each moment of unconsciousness a terrifying plunge into a dreamscape of shifting cosmic geometries and unseen eyes. I knew I couldn't stop. The signal was a question that demanded an answer, and if my peers wouldn't help, I would find it elsewhere. I started with old texts, dusty tomes I dismissed as occult ramblings in my younger, more rational days. I scoured neglected corners of the university library, places where the air hung heavy with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten knowledge. I found references in obscure philosophical treatises, in ancient myths that spoke of creation and destruction, in folklore that predated recorded history. The rational mind had long since discarded these tales as primitive attempts to explain the inexplicable. But what if the inexplicable was simply waiting? I found it in a mildewed volume, its cover warped, its pages brittle with age. It wasn't a scientific text, nor even a religious one in the conventional sense. It was a collection of fragmented carvings, translated from a dead language, detailing the cosmology of a forgotten civilization. It spoke of senses beyond human comprehension, of a reality that was merely a thin veil over something far older, far more terrible. The descriptions were vague, metaphorical, yet they resonated with an unnerving precision. Could these ancient, forgotten people have known something I was only just beginning to grasp? The hum was a roaring torrent now, not just in my head, but seeming to vibrate the very glass before me. The stars, once fixed points of light, began to shimmer, to flow with an imperceptible current like motes of dust suspended in a vast, unseen river. My breath hitched. It wasn't just my perception unraveling. It was the universe itself. What else had these ancient texts foretold? I'd tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably on the makeshift cot in the back office of the mountain observatory, but the pressure pulsed behind my eyes, a silent, rhythmic thrumming that aligned with nothing in my own biology. It wasn't just in my ears, it was in my bones, my teeth, a resonance that felt internal. My own body was becoming a receiver. I gave up on sleep around 3 a.m. The mountain night outside was a velvet curtain speckled with diamond dust, but the true spectacle was the screen in front of me. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the shifting angle of the moonlight across the control panels. My fingers, stained with stale coffee and a faint metallic tang from the equipment, danced across the holographic interface, coaxing patterns from the noise. The signal wasn't just complex. It was designed to evade, not encrypted, not coded, but structured in a way that defied conventional analysis. It was like trying to understand a language spoken by a wave or a thought expressed by a shifting dune. I'd thrown everything I had at it: neural networks, quantum algorithms, even some old, forgotten techniques for pattern recognition that barely made it into the textbooks anymore. Nothing worked. Not in the way I expected. The hum intensified, a subtle tightening behind my temples, as if a band of cold iron was slowly being clamped around my skull. My vision swam at the edges, and I found myself staring at lines of data until they blurred into abstract art, my mind trying to force meaning where there was only chaos. Then something shifted. It wasn't an algorithm that broke through, it was an intuition, a sudden cold flash of understanding that bypassed logic entirely, like a door in my mind had been kicked open. I saw a fractal pattern in the noise, not a mathematical one, but an organic, expanding structure. It clicked. I adjusted a filter, not based on any data, but on a gut feeling, a primal urge to see that particular shape repeated. The screen flickered. The chaotic waveforms for a split second coalesced. It wasn't a language. It was a direct injection of pure concept. The first sensation was vastness. Not the emptiness of space, but an overwhelming, crushing sense of scale that rendered every star, every galaxy, every cosmic structure I had ever studied into nothing more than motes of dust in an unfathomable ocean. I felt my lungs constrict, a sudden sharp intake of breath that did nothing to fill them. My vision narrowed, the bright readouts of the observatory's equipment fading at the periphery. We were less than an afterthought. We were a momentary ripple on a surface too immense to even perceive the disturbance. Not empty, but full of something. It was a fundamental presence, a deep, slumbering awareness that permeated everything, yet was utterly alien. It didn't think in terms of planets or stars. It thought in terms of long durations, epochs. The birth and death of universes were merely flickers in its peripheral awareness. My hands began to tremble. My fingers, still hovering over the console, twitched uncontrollably. The air in the mountain observatory grew heavy, thick with an unseen weight. I could smell ozone, a sharp, metallic tang, and something else beneath it, something ancient and mineral, like wet rock that had been untouched for eons. The hum in my head became a roar, a silent, deafening pressure that threatened to crack my skull open. The concepts flooded me, not as images or words, but as raw, unadulterated understanding. Our science, our philosophies, our very perception of reality, all of it was a tiny, self-referential bubble, existing only because this greater, deeper presence allowed it to. Or more horrifyingly, because it hadn't bothered to notice us yet. My eyes, fixed on the screen, perceived a shift outside the window. Through the massive domed aperture of the mountain observatory, the stars began moving. Not just drifting across the sky as the Earth turned, but shifting, twisting, blurring into streaks of impossible light that defied physics, defying everything I knew about celestial mechanics. It was as if the fabric of the night sky itself was being stretched and warped by an unseen hand, a silent, cosmic scream. A choked sound escaped my throat. My throat was dry, raspy. My chest felt tight, a band of ice squeezing my ribs. This wasn't a signal. It was a gaze. A brief, terrible glimpse into something that had always been there, lurking just beyond the veil of our comprehension, indifferent and immense, and it was waking up. The understanding wasn't just in my mind, it was in my very cells. My body recoiled, every nerve screaming in protest. I felt a sudden, profound loneliness, a sense of utter isolation in a universe that was infinitely larger and infinitely more terrible than I had ever dared to imagine. What was this presence? And what would happen when it finally opened its eyes? I'd tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably on the narrow cot in my cramped quarters, but my mind was a churning engine, unable to find purchase on the slippery slopes of unconsciousness. Every time my eyelids drooped, the signal, or rather, the knowledge gleaned from it, would flash behind them, a terrifying kaleidoscope of impossible geometries and indifferent voids. Weeks blurred into a perpetual twilight. The world outside my observation station receded, its concerns becoming distant echoes. Eating was an afterthought, a mechanical necessity. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, or perhaps was no longer permitted. My reflection in the dark monitor screen showed a stranger. Eyes deeply sunken, rimmed with purple shadows, skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. My jaw ached from clenching, a constant tension that mirrored the ceaseless thrumming in my ears. The hum was no longer external, it was internal, a fundamental frequency of my own being. I felt a change, a profound shift in my perception. It wasn't just fatigue. It was as if a veil had been lifted, or perhaps a different one had descended. The deciphered data, once a cryptic jumble, now flowed through my consciousness with an unnerving clarity. It wasn't information in the conventional sense, no equations or theories, but a deeper, more fundamental truth about existence. A revelation of scale so immense, so utterly indifferent to human endeavor, that it shattered every preconceived notion I held. The universe, I now understood, was not merely vast and empty. It was a stage set for entities that dwarfed galaxies, slumbering or stirring in realms beyond our comprehension, their very presence a silent pressure on reality. This knowledge, like a parasitic twin, began to reshape me. Conversations with the few colleagues who occasionally ventured up the desolate mountain road became exercises in polite endurance. Their chatter about budget cuts, equipment malfunctions, or even family seemed impossibly trivial, like the babbling of children in the shadow of a tsunami. I found myself staring through them, not at them, my gaze fixed on something just beyond their heads, something only I could almost perceive. Their worries, their hopes, their very existence all felt like ephemeral dust motes caught in a beam of light, soon to vanish. The first subtle distortions began then, faint at first, easily dismissed as optical fatigue or the tricks of a sleep-deprived mind. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and they would normalize. But the memory lingered, a tiny splinter under the skin of my perception. One evening, while performing routine recalibrations, the air in the cramped control room grew heavy, almost viscous. The hum intensified, a low growl that resonated in my chest cavity. I looked out through the reinforced glass of the dome, seeking the familiar comfort of the night sky, but the sky wasn't right. The stars, usually fixed points of ancient light, seemed to waver. Not a twinkle, not an atmospheric distortion, but a subtle, almost imperceptible drift. They didn't move across the sky as constellations, but each individual star seemed to shift its position, a tiny, independent tremor in the cosmic tapestry. My breath hitched. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass, my vision blurring, then sharpening with frantic intensity. I was at the mountain observatory. Stars began moving. It wasn't a trick of the light, not an illusion. The familiar patterns I had studied my entire life were subtly, fundamentally wrong. A star I knew to be in Cygnus appeared for a fleeting instant to be closer to Lyra. Then it snapped back, or perhaps I snapped back. The entire dome felt like it was humming in sync with my skull, a giant resonator amplifying the pervasive, insidious frequency. A wave of nausea washed over me, a sickening certainty that what I was seeing was real and that it was impossible. My hands trembled, gripping the cold metal railing. There was the signal doing this. Was it changing the very fabric of my perception, or was it revealing a truth that had always been there, hidden behind the comforting lie of a stable universe? What else was it showing me that I wasn't meant to see? I'd tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably on the narrow cot in my observation chamber, but my teeth ached with the resonance. My muscles twitched, and every shadow seemed to deepen, to draw closer. The silence of the facility, usually a bomb, had become a shroud, amplifying the internal tremor. 2 days blurred into a single extended vigil. My eyes felt gritty, my thoughts sluggish yet racing. Sleep was a broken thing, haunted by vague, formless shapes that shifted just beyond the edge of perception, accompanied always by that insistent hum. It wasn't just in my head. It was in the very air, a subtle vibration that made the glass of my water bottle ripple when I set it down too forcefully. I found myself drawn back to the screens, to the raw data logs, even when the main systems were offline. It wasn't just data anymore. It had taken root, an invasive species in the delicate ecosystem of my mind. The patterns shifted, repeated, spiraled in ways no natural cosmic phenomenon should. They weren't random, nor were they purely mathematical. There was an elegance to their complexity, a deliberate architecture that spoke of immense, unfathomable intelligence. But now, as I stared at the flowing lines, I began to perceive something else. A cadence. A rhythm, not just a broadcast, but a dialogue. It wasn't a question, not in any language I knew, but an undeniable pull, like a deep current dragging at the hull of a ship or the silent beckoning of a light in a dense fog. The signal wasn't just there. It was reaching out. It was a call. The realization settled in my gut like a stone. This wasn't an anomaly to be observed from a safe distance. This was an entity, a presence seeking contact. And I, against every instinct of self-preservation, felt an answering tremor, a dangerous, magnetic urge to respond, to understand. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate my very bones, aligning itself with the frequency of the signal on the screen. It felt like a part of me now. I needed to amplify it. Not just record it, not just analyze it, but experience it, directly. The standard receivers were designed for observation, for filtering, for protection. I needed to strip away the filters to bypass the safeguards. I needed to open a direct channel to step into the current. My hands, though trembling, moved with a strange, almost surgical precision. I began to repurpose an old, high-gain audio amplifier, originally meant for seismic research. It was crude, powerful, and utterly unsuited for delicate signal processing. Perfect. I stripped out its internal components, replacing them with a custom array of inductors and capacitors, salvaged from defunct equipment. The output was the crucial part. I couldn't just listen, I needed to feel it. I wired the amplifier to a series of haptic transducers, small devices that convert electrical signals into vibrations, which I then affixed to a heavy old leather helmet I'd found gathering dust in a storage locker. It was a crude, brutal setup. The transducers would press against my temples, my forehead, the base of my skull. The signal, unfiltered and raw, would vibrate directly against my bone. My mind would be the receiver. I knew the risks. My colleagues, if they knew, would call it madness. My body screamed at me, my mind recoiled from the edge of the precipice I was building for myself. But the call, the silent, pervasive summons, was stronger. It promised answers and understanding that transcended human knowledge. The mountain observatory was the only place. The night sky, even without the light pollution of the city, seemed to press down, heavy and vast. I carried my crude apparatus up the winding path, the weight of the old helmet and the modified amplifier feeling like an anchor. The wind howled around the observation dome, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the internal drone in my head. The hum here was palpable, a deep resonance that permeated the very structure of the building. I connected my cobbled-together system to the main receiver's output port, bypassing every safety interlock. The air around me seemed to thicken, charged with an invisible energy. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath shallow. They were positioned precisely where the hum felt strongest. I took a deep, shuddering breath. My finger hovered over the activation switch. The signal called. I closed my eyes, picturing the endless, lightless expanse between the galaxies. Then I flipped the switch. A jolt, not electrical, but of pure, raw sensation, slammed into my brain. The hum exploded into a roaring flood of sensation, 1,000 discordant frequencies vibrating against my skull, through my teeth into the very marrow of my bones. My vision swam behind my closed eyelids, assaulted by flashes of impossible color, shapes that defied geometry. I gasped a choked sound as my body convulsed. The room spun. The floor seemed to tilt, and the heavy equipment around me shimmered at the edges of my perception. I opened my eyes, desperate for an anchor, for something familiar, something real. Through the dome's massive viewport, the night sky stretched, a tapestry of glittering stars. But they were not still. They were not fixed points of light. The stars began moving, not drifting, not rotating, but shifting like grains of sand caught in an unseen current, forming new constellations, new impossible patterns that pulsed with the rhythm of the signal now roaring through my mind. What was I seeing? What was happening to the sky itself? I tried to sleep, curled uncomfortably on the makeshift cot in the back room, the fabric of the sleeping bag doing little to cushion the insistent, low-frequency drone. It wasn't a sound that entered my ears, not really. It resonated in the marrow of my bones, a pressure against my eardrums from the inside, a persistent thrum that felt like a tuning fork vibrating against my skull. My muscles twitched, unable to find rest. My eyelids, gritty and heavy, refused to stay closed for more than a few minutes before snapping open, scanning the familiar, shadowed contours of the room. Every shadow seemed deeper, every silence heavier, punctuated only by that internal vibration. I shivered, but it wasn't just the temperature. My colleagues had dismissed it, called it noise, an artifact. But I knew better. I felt it. After what felt like an eternity of restless tossing, my body aching with the effort of trying to relax against the insistent hum, I gave up. A desperate, almost compulsive need pulled me from the cot. I swung my legs over the side, the cold floor biting at my bare feet, but I barely registered it. The hum intensified, a silent siren song calling me back to the control room, to the banks of glowing screens and the humming machinery that was both the source of my torment and the key to understanding. My steps were heavy, each one an act of will against a growing lassitude, yet I moved with an undeniable purpose. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cold metal of the interface. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was an addiction, a compulsion. I had to know, I had to see. I powered up the primary receivers again, bypassing the automatic dampeners. The hum didn't just grow louder, it transformed, becoming a tangible force, a wave that pressed against my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. The air around me seemed to thicken, taking on a viscous quality. The screens flickered to life, displaying the familiar, yet now infinitely more complex data streams. Lines of code scrolled by, not in their usual orderly fashion, but jittering, distorting like reflections on disturbed water. My eyes burned, trying to parse the chaotic influx. My head throbbed, a dull ache blossoming into a sharp, piercing pain behind my eyes, then spreading through my entire skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it made no difference. The internal pressure was overwhelming. I felt a strange disorientation, as if my body was no longer aligned with the floor beneath my feet. A wave of nausea washed over me, bile rising in my throat. I braced myself against the console, my grip tight, fighting the urge to vomit. The world around me seemed to tilt, not physically but perceptually, as if the very coordinates of space were being subtly altered. Then it began. It wasn't a visual image, not a shape or a figure I could point to. It was a concept, a vast, sprawling intelligence that unfolded within my mind, bypassing my eyes and ears entirely. It was an understanding, raw and unfiltered, of something so utterly alien, so fundamentally other, that my brain struggled to reconcile it with any known framework. I saw, or rather, perceived, a tapestry of existence woven not from matter and energy, but from something far more fundamental, something that predated the very concepts of space and time. It wasn't a being with limbs or eyes or a voice, but a colossal, intricate pattern, a living geometry that pulsed with an indifferent, ancient awareness. It was the negative space between galaxies, the silent hum of the cosmic background, the fundamental tremor beneath reality itself. My consciousness stretched, pulled thin across unimaginable distances. I was no longer Raj, alone in the mountain observatory. I was a motes of dust caught in an infinite current, perceiving the grand, slow machinations of something that existed before the universe, or perhaps was the universe, in a way humans could never comprehend. Not just blurring or shifting slightly, but moving with an impossible, fluid grace across the dome of the night sky, visible through the observatory's main aperture. They stretched, elongated into impossible streaks of light, then coalesced, forming new constellations, new patterns that defied all astronomical laws. They were not fixed points of light, they were threads in a grand design being rewoven by an unseen hand. I saw them warp and bend, not as distant suns, but as malleable elements in a cosmic loom. It was a swirling, active vortex, a nexus of this impossible intelligence, silently, patiently, rearranging everything. My perception shattered. My sense of self frayed at the edges, my individuality dissolving into the vastness. I felt my memories scatter like blown sand, my name, my purpose, my very identity becoming meaningless noise against the immense, silent symphony of this entity. It wasn't trying to communicate in a human sense. It was communication, a pure, unadulterated transfer of raw, cosmic truth directly into my consciousness. Its purpose wasn't malevolent nor benevolent. It simply was. It was a slow, inevitable reshaping of reality, a cosmic sculptor working on a timescale beyond human grasp. Humanity, our history, our aspirations, our very existence, we were merely ephemeral dust motes, caught in the currents of its indifferent design. A fleeting aberration, a temporary pattern that would eventually be rewoven, repurposed, or simply allowed to unravel. My body convulsed, a desperate attempt to reject the invading knowledge. My throat was raw from a scream I didn't realize I was making, a sound swallowed by the profound, silent roar in my head. The air thinned further, or perhaps it was my own lungs ceasing to function correctly. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer overload of impossible data. The stars continued their impossible dance outside, a silent testament to the unraveling order. I was falling, not through space, but through layers of reality, each one peeling away to reveal another, more terrifying truth beneath. What was left of my mind grasped at a single, desperate thought. If this was its form, what was its will? And what would become of everything once its work was complete? The low-frequency drone had become a permanent resident in my skull, a resonant hum that vibrated the very bones of my face. It wasn't a sound I could escape by plugging my ears. It was inside me, a pressure from the marrow outwards. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted, a mere dimming of awareness rather than true rest. I'd wake with a jolt, the drone amplifying for a moment before settling back into its oppressive rhythm, leaving me tangled in the cot's thin blankets, my skin slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. My eyes felt gritty, perpetually strained. The fluorescent lights of the control room, usually a harsh but familiar glare, now seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, not quite stable. I'd rub my temples, convinced it was just fatigue, but the sensation persisted, a subtle unsteadiness to the light like viewing it through rippling water. The air, too, felt different. Heavy. Not humid, not cold, but dense, as if the atmosphere itself had gained mass, pressing down on my shoulders, making each breath a conscious effort. I found myself taking shallower gulps, my chest feeling tight. I moved through the cramped corridors of the facility like a ghost, my own footsteps seeming alien, muffled. My colleagues, the few remaining, kept their distance, their gazes darting away when I met them. I saw the same strain in their faces, the same haunted look in their eyes, though they attributed it to the long shifts, the endless data, the pressure of the project. But I knew it was more. I could feel the subtle shift in their presence, a new kind of quietness that wasn't peace but a deep, unsettled stillness. They spoke less, moved with a hesitant grace, as if testing the ground before each step. One morning, or what passed for morning in the windowless heart of the place, I made my way to the primary observation deck, drawn by a vague, persistent unease that had nothing to do with the drone. The vast primary reflector, a gleaming dish of metal and intricate machinery, sat silently pointed towards the heavens. Through the reinforced glass of the dome, the sky was a canvas of bruised purples and deep, unnatural blues. It wasn't dawn, it wasn't dusk. It was a perpetual twilight that had settled over the mountain observatory, and then I saw it. The stars, they began moving, not drifting, not twinkling, but shifting. A slow, deliberate crawl. A constellation I had known since childhood, Orion, seemed to stretch, its belt stars elongating, then contracting as if breathing. The familiar patterns warped, became fluid like ink spilled on velvet. My breath hitched. My hands gripped the console, gripped tight. This wasn't an optical illusion, not a trick of tired eyes. This was the sky unmaking itself. The very fabric of the celestial sphere was being kneaded, reshaped by an unseen hand. It was as if the ancient, fixed points of light, the anchors of human navigation and wonder, had become mere reflections on a disturbed surface. My eyes darted from star to star, trying to find a stable point, a single fixed beacon in the swirling chaos, but there was none. Everything was in flux, a slow, terrifying dance of cosmic dissolution. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the bone-deep drone. This wasn't just happening to me, not just in my head. I could see the other technicians, drawn by the same impossible spectacle, pressing their faces against the glass, their mouths agape, uttering choked, disbelieving sounds. One of them, a younger man, slowly sank to his knees, his hands covering his eyes, but even then I could hear his ragged gasps, as if the sight was searing itself onto the inside of his eyelids. The comms room crackled with frantic reports, not just from our sector, but from other observatories, other remote stations. The voices were tight, strained, filled with a nascent panic that wasn't yet screaming, but was a low, desperate plea for explanation. The stellar positions are anomalous. A voice from a European network reported, the words clipped with disbelief. Gravitational lensing models are failing, complete atmospheric distortion, or something else entirely. Another from a station in the southern hemisphere spoke of impossible auroras painting the night sky, not just green and red, but shades of indigo and sickly yellow, shimmering with an intelligence that defied all meteorological explanation. It wasn't just the sky, not riots, not chaos, but a profound quietness. People looking up perpetually. A collective sense of being watched, of the world holding its breath. The drone, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just in my bones. It was in the air, in the ground, a fundamental frequency now bleeding into the world, an unheard note that resonated in the collective unconscious. My own heightened perception, once a curse, was now a horrifying clarity. I was a receiver, tuned to the frequency of the unraveling. The entity wasn't just communicating with me anymore. It was leaking. Its presence was seeping through the veil, touching everything, everywhere. The stars continued their slow, impossible ballet, each movement a confirmation of a reality bent, a universe reshaped. There was this what waited beyond the static. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted, a mere dimming of a persistent awareness. My waking hours were a blur of cold coffee and screen glare, chasing patterns that shifted like smoke, trying to pin down the impossible. I'd retreated fully to the mountain observatory, the only place I felt even a semblance of control over my observations. The air here was thin, biting, and smelled of pine and ozone. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive, humid stillness that seemed to cling to everything else. I needed the isolation, the quiet hum of the machinery, my only company besides the omnipresent thrum in my head. The seemingly empty space between the grand cosmic structures, the place where the signal originated. I'd been watching it for weeks, months even, convinced I was seeing things no human was meant to perceive. The drone was louder up here, sharper, resonating with the very structure of the building, making the metal catwalk sing a low, guttural note. The first subtle shifts had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly a few days ago. The lines of the control room console, usually so precise, would occasionally waver like heat haze over asphalt. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and they would snap back to normal, leaving me questioning my own vision. Was it fatigue, the relentless drone, or something else entirely? It wasn't just external. It felt internal, a frigid whisper in my veins. My breath plumed in front of me even indoors, clinging to the air like a ghost. I remember the precise moment the true unraveling began. It was a clear night, the kind that makes I feel utterly insignificant, lost in the vastness. I was in the main dome, the colossal telescope pointed skyward, its optics drinking in the distant light. I had just finished calibrating, the drone in my skull momentarily eclipsed by the whirring of gears and the creak of the dome rotating. I settled into my chair, eyes fixed on the display, a cascade of raw data scrolling past, and then I saw it. At first I thought it was an artifact of the optics, a minor tremor in the delicate alignment. but the readouts were stable. The internal gyroscopes reported no anomalies. Yet there it was, undeniable even on the raw feed. The stars began moving. Not drifting, not twinkling, not shifting due to atmospheric distortion. They moved. A cluster of distant galaxies, usually a static smudge of light, began to smear not uniformly, but as if each individual star within it was tracing an impossibly precise, non-Euclidean path. They didn't obey the laws of celestial mechanics. They didn't revolve around a central point. They simply shifted, each one charting its own terrifying course. My breath hitched. My hands clenched the armrests of my chair, gripped tight. The internal drone amplified, vibrating my teeth, a guttural roar in the echo chamber of my skull. The sky itself was becoming fluid, yielding to an unseen pressure. I tore my gaze from the monitor and rushed to the viewing port, pressing my face against the cold glass. Above me, outside the dome of the mountain observatory, stars began moving. They were rearranging themselves, like cosmic dust motes caught in an unseen current. Constellations, familiar since childhood, warped, their defining lines bending into impossible curves. Orion's belt became an arc, the Big Dipper stretched and twisted into a helix. It was as if the firmament itself was a vast, shimmering membrane being manipulated by something beyond comprehension. My vision blurred, the impossible geometry of the stars burning into my retinas. I fumbled for the radio, twisting the dial. Static hissed, then a jumble of voices, frantic, fragmented. A colleague, the one I'd tried to warn, his voice thin and reedy, talking about impossible structures appearing on the horizon in distant cities. Another, a scientist from a seismic station, mentioning impossible tremors, not from tectonic plates but from a deeper, resonant source. Then a shriek, cut off abruptly by a burst of pure, high-pitched feedback that made me drop the receiver as if it had burned me. The drone inside my head peaked, a deafening crescendo that threatened to split my skull. My eyes were drawn back to the sky, to the mountain observatory. Stars began moving with an accelerating, terrible grace. They were forming patterns, not random but deliberate. Shapes that were simultaneously flat and three-dimensional, impossibly intricate, shifting into one another with seamless, sickening fluidity. It wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a language being written across the cosmos, a declaration. It was a canvas, or perhaps a surface, and whatever was using it to scribe its message was not merely observing, it was acting. It was here. My fingers trembled as I reached for the primary console again, my gaze fixed on the impossible dance above. The movements, the shifts, the warping of space-time itself. And then I understood. This wasn't just an awakening. It was an expansion. The presence wasn't just influencing reality. It was becoming reality, bending the very fabric of existence to its will, not from some distant realm, but from within our own. The universe, as I had known it, was a fragile illusion, a veil over something ancient and vast. The stars continued their impossible ballet, and I felt a strange, detached calm settle over me, a terrible acceptance. The shapes in the sky, now more defined, seemed to press down to expand, growing larger, closer, impossibly real. What would happen when the last star found its new place in this terrifying geometry? Sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted, a mere dimming of the incessant thrum. I was a drum, my head a taut skin beaten by an unseen internal mallet. Each beat was a whisper, a suggestion, nudging my thoughts down paths I hadn't chosen. My determination, once a steady flame, now felt like kindling for an unknown fire, my will less my own than an echo of the signal's command. I spent my days at the mountain observatory, the air thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a metallic tang that seemed to emanate from the very rock. The chill seeped into my joints, a cold that settled deep, mirroring the internal pressure. The colossal dish, a sentinel against the stark sky, felt less like an instrument and more like a vast, receptive ear. I wasn't merely operating it. I was attuning it, guided by an instinct that bypassed logic. My fingers moved across the controls with a strange, fluid grace, adjusting frequencies, realigning sensors, inputting parameters that had no basis in my previous research. It was as if another, more ancient intellect was using my hands, my knowledge, to prepare for something. My reflection in the glass of the control panel showed a stranger. The skin around them was stretched, almost translucent, revealing a network of fine, pulsing veins. My jaw was perpetually clenched, a tightness that radiated down my neck. The drone was no longer a single note. It was a chord, a chorus of impossibly deep frequencies, each note carrying a distinct alien resonance. They didn't speak words, but they conveyed meaning, a complex tapestry of information that flooded my mind without passing through the filter of language. One night, the drone intensified, becoming a physical vibration that rattled the very teeth in my skull. I clutched the console, my grip tight against the cool metal. The air around me thickened, growing heavy with a static charge that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The scent of ozone mingled with the metallic tang, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint, high-pitched whine emanating from the core of the mountain itself, a sympathetic resonance with the sound in my head. My vision blurred at the edges, my peripheral sight dissolving into a shimmering haze. Then, through the dome's massive aperture in the crisp, black expanse above the mountain observatory, stars began moving. Not in the familiar, stately drift of celestial mechanics, but with a fluid, almost organic motion. They didn't simply shift, they flowed. Constellations unraveled like threads from a cosmic loom, reweaving themselves into impossible geometries. Pinprick lights stretched into shimmering lines, then coalesced into vast, nebulous forms that pulsed with an internal violet light. It was as if the very canvas of the night sky had become pliable, a living membrane responding to an unheard melody. A profound nausea seized me, a dizzying sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with the fundamental reordering of reality. My stomach churned, and I tasted bile, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. My skin felt like it was shedding, a phantom sensation of epidermal layers sloughing off, revealing something raw and new beneath. My bones ached, not with fatigue but with a deep, resonant vibration, as if they were tuning forks struck by an invisible hammer. The drone swelled to an unbearable crescendo, then abruptly fractured into a myriad of distinct, individual voices, each one a different tone, a different frequency, yet all harmonizing in a single, incomprehensible chorus. They were not speaking to me. They were speaking through me. My own thoughts became indistinct, muffled by the sheer volume of alien consciousness flowing into and out of my being. I felt my perception stretch, expanding beyond the confines of the observatory, beyond the Earth, beyond the galaxy. Not life as we understood it, not cellular or organic, but something vast, energetic, consciousness itself woven into the fabric of space-time. I saw, or rather understood, the slumbering entities that governed it, not as gods or demons, but as fundamental principles, vast, ancient intelligences existing in dimensions my human mind could only grasp as impossible geometries and shifting colors. They were not malicious, not benevolent, they simply were, and their existence dwarfed all human understanding to an infinitesimal speck. My body was no longer mine. It was a vessel, a conduit. My arms felt too long, my fingers too many. My eyes, though still fixed on the impossible sky, saw with a new clarity, perceiving layers of reality that had always been hidden. The metallic tang was the scent of pure, unadulterated existence. I was no longer Raj, the astrophysicist. I was a window, a lens, perhaps even a nascent part of the very phenomenon I had sought to understand. The internal drone had become my own heartbeat, and the chorus of alien voices my thoughts. The stars continued their impossible dance, each movement a word in a language I now instinctively understood, yet could never translate back into human terms. They were telling a story, an epic of creation and dissolution, of cycles too vast for any single mind to comprehend. And I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, my consciousness woven into the tapestry of their cosmic ballet. What was left of Raj, if anything at all, to witness this new dawn? Sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted, a mere dimming of the insistent resonance, never a true cessation. My skin felt perpetually clammy, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to be vibrating along with the internal sound. Each breath was a conscious effort, a fight against the pervasive weight that settled in my chest. My hands, I noticed, trembled almost constantly, a fine, barely perceptible tremor that spoke of nerves frayed to their absolute limits. Yet I pressed on. What choice did I have? The signal was a siren song, a cosmic enigma that had become my sole purpose, my only truth. I packed my minimal gear, the familiar hum now a constant companion as I drove, the engine's rumble almost a counterpoint to the drone in my head. The ascent to the mountain observatory was arduous, the winding road growing steeper, narrower, the air thinning with each hairpin turn. The vehicle groaned, protesting the incline, and I felt a strange kinship with its mechanical struggle. The world outside the windshield seemed sharper, the edges of the pines more defined, the shadows deeper, as if reality itself was being honed to a finer, more terrifying point. The cold seeped into the vehicle, a damp chill that settled in my bones, despite the heater blasting. Finally, the squat, domed silhouette of the observatory loomed against the twilight sky. It was a brutalist structure built for function, not aesthetics standing sentinel on the jagged peak. The air here was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp rock. The drone intensified, resonating now not just in my skull, but in the very ground beneath my boots, a deep, subaudible thrum that seemed to vibrate the entire mountain. This place, isolated and stark, felt like a threshold, a final point of no return. The main dome, a cavernous space, swallowed the sound of my footsteps. The giant telescope, a colossal eye of metal and glass, dominated the room, its polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the control panels. My fingers, surprisingly steady, moved over the familiar buttons. I had to see it. I had to confront the source, whatever it was, however much it had already claimed of me. My reflection in the monitor showed a gaunt, wide-eyed man, a stranger with a peculiar intensity in his gaze. I initiated the sequence, the servos groaning as the massive dome began to rotate, a slow, grinding sound that grated against the drone. A segment of the roof retracted, revealing the inky blackness of the night sky, a canvas impossibly vast, studded with distant, indifferent pinpricks of light. I guided the telescope, my movements precise, honed by countless hours of observation. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it, the culmination of everything. As the telescope locked onto its target, the drone became a roar. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was in the air, vibrating the glass of the monitors, shaking the very floor. My vision blurred at the edges. I pressed my face to the eyepiece, the cold metal biting into my brow. It was there, a patch of absolute blackness, devoid of stars, devoid of galaxies, an absence so profound it felt like a physical presence. And then it wasn't empty. Not anymore. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate beat like a colossal, unseen heart. Not drifting, not shifting in the gentle cosmic dance I understood. They moved. They streaked, they twisted, they contorted, leaving trails of impossible light. It was as if the entire celestial sphere was a malleable, liquid thing being stirred by an unseen hand. Lines of light, impossibly straight, then impossibly curved, connected stars that had no business being linked. Constellations warped, stretching into grotesque caricatures of themselves, then dissolving into abstract patterns that defied geometry. My stomach lurched. I stumbled back from the eyepiece, gasping, my hands flying to my head. The drone was a tearing sound now, a ripping inside my mind as if the very sutures of my skull were coming undone. The air grew thick, heavy, tasting of ozone and something metallic, something utterly alien. I looked up at the opening in the dome, at the impossible sky. They were weaving, interchanging positions, forming patterns that reformed and dissolved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. It was a cosmic tapestry being rewoven before my eyes, not by natural forces, but by an intelligence so vast, so ancient that it rendered all human understanding moot. The signal. It wasn't just a signal. It was a transformation. The drone wasn't a sound, it was the resonant frequency of a reality being unmade and remade. My perception, my very sense of being was fracturing. I saw shapes that were not shapes, colors that did not exist, felt textures that defied touch. The mountain observatory, the earth beneath me, the air I breathed, it all felt like a thin veil, a fragile illusion stretched over something immense and formless. The violet light intensified, bleeding into the edges of my vision, washing out the details of the control room. The hum became a sustained chord, a single, resonant note that vibrated through every cell of my body. I felt a pulling sensation, a gentle unspooling of my consciousness, an invitation to merge with the impossible ballet unfolding above. My hands stretched out, trembling not in fear, but in a strange, terrible awe. The vastness of it, the utter indifference, the sheer scale of the being that was not a being, but a fundamental principle, a living architecture of the cosmos, was overwhelming. I was a collection of vibrating particles, a locus of awareness caught in the periphery of something truly grand, something that had always been here, slumbering, and was now, finally, awake. The stars continued their dance, weaving new constellations, forming symbols that burned themselves into the very fabric of my dissolving mind. What did these new patterns mean? What did they foretell for the quiet, fragile world I had once known?